Thanks. It's an honor to be invited here. I am both French and American, and so I feel like a strong sense of belonging in this environment. This is a topic I'm really delighted to talk to you about because it's consumed a large part of my life, but I think I enjoyed it tremendously, and I think it was for the good. I started my career in medicine in a very conventional format. I spent 20 years in Canada and the United States, where I went to medical school. I did a PhD in cognitive neuroscience under a Nobel laureate at the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, then eventually did my training in psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh and started one of the first research laboratories in the US on cognitive neuroscience as applied to the understanding of mental illness, founded by the National Institute of Mental Health. So I was a very conventional physician and researcher. It turned out that I was doing a number of missions with Doctors Without Borders at the same time, and then during one of these missions I worked with the Tibetan physicians, and I realized they had a very different approach to medicine that intrigued me. And to my great surprise, when I came back to Pittsburgh, I started looking at the scientific literature on the type of methods that these Tibetan physicians had been using, whether nutrition or acupuncture or meditation, and I found a good number of scientific papers documenting the benefits of such results. I started applying these methods in my own practice as a psychiatrist, and to my almost disbelief, I found out that not only they obviously worked, but that they often worked better than what I had been conventionally trained to use. This was, of course, a very dramatic turn in my career, which led to the development of a Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh, where we started to practice these approaches. Let me tell you a little bit about what these natural methods of treatment rely on in order to work. We're all very familiar with the fact that our body harbors natural mechanisms of healing. I do a fair amount of cooking myself, and I'm also particularly awkward with my hands. In fact, in medical school, I was very interested in surgery, but I was rapidly reoriented towards psychiatry, as a matter of fact, and I have no regrets. This has been very enjoyable for me. But I still am awkward with my hands, and when I cook to this day, I reasonably frequently cut myself. And when I cut myself, I noticed something that every one of you in this room has noticed as well, which is that initially it bleeds, and then with a little bit of help of the paper that you put around it, it stops bleeding by itself. And within about a week or two, the wound has closed up, and it has closed up in such an efficient way that you cannot even notice where the original damage was done. Everybody's noticed that. We all agree. Now that is the signature of something we take for granted, but which is a natural healing mechanism that is part of the body. The entire claim I will be making tonight is that a similar natural healing mechanism exists within the brain, and particularly the emotional part of the brain, which we'll return to in a few minutes. We also have evidence of this that we vastly underestimate. For example, I give you another personal example that they often work most clearly. When I was between the ages of 12 and 14, I insisted, I think almost every day, with my parents in order that I would have a moped when I would turn 14. God has his way of taking revenge, because my son just turned 12 and he started and sometimes several times a day, to talk about this electric scooter that he would like to get. Anyway, I must have been convincing, because on the morning of my 14th birthday, I did get a moped, and on the afternoon of my 14th birthday, I got my first moped accident. Oh. And I was driving along a line of parked cars in Paris, and somebody opened their door right in front of me. I rammed into the door, flew over, and landed on the ground. I had bruises all over my body, but I also had bruises in my mind. How do you know you have bruises in your mind? Well, in that case, when I went the next day to school, I had difficulty concentrating. I would have images coming back frequently to my mind of what had happened. I also noticed I wouldn't sleep well. Then I was even afraid of getting back on the moped, and my parents thought I had vaccinated myself immediately from this moped problem, but that was not counting with the fact that there is a natural healing mechanism, because within about 2 weeks, this progressively faded. I no longer had trouble concentrating, I could sleep okay, and no nightmares anymore, and eventually I got back on the moped, and to this day, I don't have a car in Paris, but only a bicycle, and I continue to enjoy this way of getting around. Now, what is really interesting in this example is not my personal story, but the fact that it's happened to every one of us, and that this mechanism of healing is almost like a digestion system. It eliminated what is toxic and unnecessary, the fear, the anxiety, the nightmares, but it kept what was useful and adaptive for my organism, my body, which is the memory I have, and which is now automatic, and it manifests itself almost every day as I ride my bike around in Paris. When I drive along a line of parked cars, I automatically keep the safe distance of an open door between them and me. So my brain has kept what was useful and adaptive, gotten rid of everything else. I didn't have to make any effort for it to do that. This is a natural mechanism of healing that is part of all of us. These methods of treatment that I talked about and started using in the center in Pittsburgh and described in this book, Healing Without Freud or Prozac, rely on these natural mechanisms of balancing in the body and in the mind. I will not go over all of them tonight because we don't have the time for that, and I would like to show you some specific things tonight. I'll show you videos, we'll do a demonstration with one of you in the room so you can have a sense for how these things work. So I'm not going to expand on everything. It's too high. But among these methods that I described, what is very striking to me is that they're both ancestral and extremely modern. For example, acupuncture, we have evidence that it's been around. I put a book underneath because I couldn't find the thing. The acupuncture has been around for about 5,000 years. We have evidence of that now. So it is not a modern method of treatment. However, the Harvard studies that have looked at what is happening in the brain when we put a needle in this part of the hand, and that shows that the area for anxiety in the brain is turned off by the stimulation of the needle in this particular part of the brain, of the hand. This is 3 years old. So these are very recent discoveries in science that come and validate ancestral approaches. Physical exercise was talked about by Juvenal about 100 years of this common era. Here in this room we could say 100 years AD. Thank you. So Juvenal was saying that in order to be in good health, you have to have a healthy mind and a healthy body, and he was insisting on the importance of physical exercise. This is not a new idea, but the Duke studies, the Duke University studies, have compared physical exercise to an antidepressant and found that 30 minutes 3 times a week is exactly as effective in terms of relieving depression as an antidepressant. But that not only that, but when you look a year later after treatment, people who were on an antidepressant and who stopped taking it have relapsed, 40% of them have. Whereas if you treated yourself with 30 minutes of jogging 3 times a week, only 8% of people have relapsed. So it's 4 times less. These studies are very modern. Nutrition will come back to it. It's not a new idea. Hippocrates used to say, let your food be your medicine and your medicine be your food. But we'll show you tonight how very modern discoveries now explain to us in detail what is happening in the brain, how that helps emotional balance, and what exactly we should learn to do for ourselves in order to maintain this balance. Then I will talk about emotional integration through eye movements, which is discovered only 20 years ago, which is very recent, and mindfulness meditation through the method of cardiac coherence. Mindfulness meditation is a very ancient method of treatment linked with a number of religious traditions, not only Buddhism, but we now have evidence that the Ave Maria induces a particular physiological state that is linked to what we know is healthy for the body and the mind. And then the most ancient methods of all is chronobiology, or the control of biology through the relationship to light and the changes in daylight. We know that for 200 million years, every mammal species that sleeps during the day and sleeps during the night and wakes up during the day has all of its biological rhythms driven by the onset of light in the morning. And we know that behind closed eyelids, our eyes pick up the change in the level of light that occurs with sunrise. And we know that as this happens, biological rhythms such as cortisol and temperature and REM sleep, the state of dreaming, get affected, so that there's a progressive transition into wakefulness. And that when people wake in that way, that we now have demonstration that they're in a better mood, and that it actually prevents the typical winter blues that affects about 15 to 30% of us in northern societies. So it is both a very ancient method, it is 200 million years old, and at the same time an extraordinarily modern demonstration that when you use a simulation of this sunrise with a particular lamp that you can program to start doing this a little bit before 7 o'clock, then you achieve very powerful health benefits. So the kind of medicine that we are moving toward now is an integrated form of medicine, where we integrate conventional and natural approaches. One of the strong driving forces around the world in favor of this medicine is the National Institute of Health, which now dedicates about $115 million a year just to do research on natural methods of treatment, what they call complementary and alternative methods of treatment. Let me step back for a second and talk about a basic fact about the constitution of the brain and the body, which is at the core of how these natural methods of treatment work. It's also good news for us because what I'm about to tell you is that we don't have a single brain, as most of us believe we do, but we actually have two. There is one brain, the cognitive brain, which is what we're most familiar with. When we think of the brain as human beings, this is the one we think about. But it's actually only the surface of the brain. In scientific terms, it is referred to as the neocortex, from the Latin new bark, new envelope, new surface. New because only species that have evolved late have developed this kind of cortex. This is the part of the brain that is responsible for consciousness, for language, for attention, for foreplanning, and for problem solving. Here we see a study in our laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh. So what we see here is a study where you see the prefrontal cortex, this part that's right above the eyes and behind the forehead, the part that distinguishes us most from apes. You know, apes have a forehead that leans back like this. This part is what distinguishes us from apes. And this is very active during a task when the student in the scanner is actively manipulating symbols to combine them with each other, which is what we're very good at doing as human beings. And this gets very activated. This is another study in our lab, a very different one, where we injected a drug in the antecubital vein that directly activates a very deep part of the brain, which is so-called emotional brain, that every mammal species possesses, but even reptiles. We share this part of the brain with reptiles. It is responsible for a very different aspect of our functioning. I have to say that the first person to get that injection in the scanner was my brother, who's sitting right here, and he still holds it some degree against me, because what this drug does is it activates directly the deepest part of the brain that are responsible for strong emotions, and particularly for fear. And in this very case, This area of the brain called the amygdala is responsible for a very intense emotion of fear. Now the reason we could do this ethically is because it lasts only 1 minute, but it lasted a bit longer for him. This is why delighted with the experience. It's true that, no, anyway. So this part of the brain, which you see here, lights up independently of the rest of the brain, independently of the cortex. And it has a career, it functions by itself. This emotional brain functions on different principles than the cognitive brain. It is largely unconscious, it is based on instincts and reflexes, and what it does is it controls everything that happens in the body. For example, we know it controls something called the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic because we have no conscious control over that part of the nervous system. These are the branches of the nervous system that tell the heart how fast to beat, that tell blood pressure whether to go up or down, and that tell the gut whether to activate or stop. And you wish you had control over this, but you don't. This is a part of the nervous system that you cannot tell what to do, just like you could with your little finger. I can tell it to go up and down as much as I want. Not the autonomic nervous system. But the emotional brain has control over that. This is where it originates from, actually, from the emotional brain. And this is why when you have strong emotions, they manifest in how your heart beats, how your blood pressure changes, or what your gut does. Not only that, but the emotional brain directly controls all of the hormones in the body. Which is why, you know, all of us know these stories of women who couldn't have a child and eventually adopted one, and then a few months later they become pregnant. Something happens in the deep core part of their emotional brain that changes the nature of hormonal production and changes the way the whole body functions. And now we even have evidence that the molecules secreted within the emotional brain and released throughout the body even control the immune system. This is a study, a picture of a cancer cell here being attacked by natural killer cells of the immune system. And what we know is that on the surface of these natural killer cells are receptors for the very same molecules that are being secreted by the emotional brain. We in fact even know that these immune cells in turn secrete substances that go and affect what happens in the emotional brain. So some researchers call this a moving brain, a circulating brain, because everything is connected. Methods, and the one I practiced perhaps the most and that I teach at the University of Pittsburgh, but also in an institute in Paris and at the School of Medicine in Lyon, is perhaps my favorite one. It is the neuroemotional integration through EMDR. So EMDR stands for a very strange thing, and we don't even spell it out any longer. It's like, it means eye movement, desensitization and reprocessing, barbarous terms that are not particularly helpful. But the idea is that when we go through something very painful in life, and it might be a car accident, or it could be a romantic separation, could be a divorce, could be a rape, could be the loss of a child, or sometimes events that are considered minor but that leave a deep wound, such as a miscarriage or an abortion. When we go through these kinds of events, they can leave a very profound wound inside our emotional brain, one that the natural mechanisms of healing do not succeed in healing. We know that normally the information about what happens to us gets reprocessed during the night, and particularly during the dream state. But it's as if for these very traumatic events, that mechanism that takes place during the dream state is not sufficient for inducing healing. And what a psychologist discovered in California about 20 years ago now, late 80s, is that if somebody's been traumatized and they keep thinking about what happened, they have images of what happened, and that induces a sense of discomfort and pain in their body, you can have them focus on that and then have them look at your finger and move their eyes in the way that eyes move spontaneously during dream sleep. And let them focus on what happens spontaneously in their mind as they do that. And when you induce this mechanism that apparently was not able to do the job by itself, when you induce it during a conscious state in the psychologist's office, that you can induce a very rapid resolution of symptoms of trauma. And only a few months before this visit, she had started a new relationship with a man that this time she was quite in love with, and he was a very pleasant partner. But she realized that she could not have any form of physical intimacy with him because she felt that she was so disgusting that she could not imagine that anybody would want to share this intimacy with her. In particular, she saw herself as extremely fat, disgustingly fat. Now you will see she's not thin, but we all know that in the US we have a wide epidemic of obesity, and Pittsburgh is the third city in the country with the largest amount of people overweight and obese. So she looked like every nurse in the hospital. There was nothing about her that justified this self-image of disgust. So I tried to find out with her, as we do when we proceed with this method, what were the traumatic events that may have induced for you this change of self-image. She never had any sexual problems before, but we couldn't find one. So I asked her to focus on what was the most traumatic event in her mind now. And she said, oh, that's very easy. It's the idea of looking at myself naked in a mirror. That would be unbearable. So I told her, okay, fine, let's do that. Imagine yourself looking at yourself naked in a mirror. She said, she did it. And I asked her on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is calm, no distress, and 10, the most intense perturbation that you can imagine feeling, where do you put yourself now? She said 15. I said, you're not allowed 15. So she said, okay, 10. And then she started crying. And all I did at this time, at this point, as we do with this method, instead of talking about it, instead of patting her on the back, instead of holding her hand, all I did was ask her to follow an object. You'll see it's a stick that moves in front of her eyes. And let whatever happens, happen. Let any thoughts, any emotions, any physical sensations that come up follow their natural course. Maybe we should be... No, there's no sound. Do you hear anything? Yeah. Turn it louder though.
It's very it's good to get in touch with that pain. Keep breath. Standing back.
And he's still a useless piece of crap. I can't stand them.
So we kept going like this for about 20 minutes, and 20 minutes later I asked her to come back on the original picture of her naked in the mirror and to tell me what does it look like now.
A 30-year-old who had 2 kids.
So this is what it looks like when you tap into the natural healing power of the emotional brain. Now, I was a neuroscientist, I was head of a lab when I encountered this method, and it seemed extraordinarily suspicious to me that something such as having someone move their eyes back and forth could help heal anything as deep as trauma. Fortunately, by the time I got interested in it, there had already been a number of studies published in the literature showing that this was not just a matter of a single patient. Maybe this woman was particularly suggestible. Maybe she would have responded to any kind of intervention. Or it was not a matter of the powerful animal magnetism of the person doing the treatment. Now, in this case, it's easy because it was me, so I knew that it could be that. But there was something about the treatment itself, about the procedure itself, that was effective. And this is one of the studies that is in the literature, which looked at people who had not just like this woman, a traumatic event in their life. These are people that had post-traumatic stress disorder. These are people with very serious stress symptoms. And when you see here their symptoms on the scale, it goes to 75 actually, but anything above 20 or 22 is considered to be post-traumatic stress disorder. And so when they enter the study, on average they're around 40, so they're pretty affected by the condition. And this is their score after 3 sessions of EMDR. 3 sessions. The mean of the population, by the way, is 10. So they're very close to the mean of the population. Now the second question, and so this works with, these are 37 different people with 3 different therapists, so it's not a matter of a single person or a single therapist. But the other question you ask when you see something like this is, how could a method that works so quickly have lasting effects? Fortunately, the same researchers had looked at 15 months follow-up. This is 3 months after the 3 sessions, and you see that it hasn't gone back. There's no further treatment here. And it hasn't gotten back to its initial level. And this is 15 months with no further treatment. And if anything, it just keeps getting better over time. It has triggered the healing mechanism, and once it's over, it's over. It's as if you had emptied an abscess and cleaned the inside, and the body is able to take over and heal the wound. Another method I want to talk to you about, which taps into the body's natural healing instinct, is so-called cardiac coherence. For about 5,000 years, traditions such as yoga and Tai Chi and meditation or Qigong have claimed that if you focus your concentration and control your respiration, you can have a very profound effect on the entire physiology of the body. So much so that in ancient Chinese, it's no longer true in modern Chinese, but in ancient Chinese, the character, the ideogram for the concept of thought was made of 2 characters. One for brain, here you see a brain in the box, and one for heart. You see the 4 chambers of the heart. This is quite remarkable in this character. As if thought had to necessarily be a combination of what happens inside the skull and what happens inside the heart. Now you might think these ancient Chinese were quite poetic people. Obviously thought is about feelings and thinking, but in reality what they had was a very deep physiological insight, as I'm about to show you. We'll do a demonstration on this. These are the powerful neural connections between the emotional brain right here and the heart. There are 2 parallel pathways. One is called the sympathetic nervous system, which relies on adrenaline to speed up the heart rate, increase blood pressure, prepare the body for fight or flight. Another one next to it here is the parasympathetic pathway, which uses acetylcholine in order to slow down heart rate, reduce blood pressure, prepare the body for phases of restoration and relaxation. Now, it's a bit like a brake, an accelerator and a brake. it's not that there's a good one and a bad one. Both of them are necessary. You cannot drive a car without both an accelerator and a brake. And in fact, at every moment, these two branches of our autonomic nervous system, we have no control with our will over them. Only the emotional brain controls them. These two branches of the autonomic nervous system adapt. They put a little bit more of gas, a little bit more of brake as a function of where we are and what we're dealing with in our environment. And this gets translated, oh, by the way, whatever then happens in the heart feeds back into the emotional brain. Therefore, it really is a loop, and you should really be talking about a heart-brain system. It doesn't make sense to think of the brain being independent of what happens at the level of the heart. And we can see this very regularly on one of the simplest tests that we use almost every day in medicine, which is the electrocardiogram, the EKG. What you notice on any regular EKG, and this is a very normal EKG, a normal person, you notice that the heart seems to beat quite regularly if you just look at it with your eyes. But if you measure the interval between two consecutive heartbeats, you notice that each interval is slightly different from the previous one. Now, this interval is 859 milliseconds, and for those of you very good at math, you can compute how many beats per minute would that be. Right? It's about 70. Okay, so if every interval stayed the same, stayed this, it would be 70 beats per minute. Now, if you look at the next interval, you see it's a little shorter, just a touch, but it's a little shorter. And in fact, if it stayed like that, it would be 75 beats per minute. And then you look at the third one, and it's shorter still. So it would now be 80 beats per minute. So with each beat, the heart rate is adjusting itself to something, to what's happening in the physiology and what's happening in the environment. If we now plot for each interval, how many beats per minute would that be if it stayed the same? Over a period of 4 minutes, this is what it looks like. So it starts at 60, the next interval it's at 65, goes back down to 60, back to 65, and so on. And it keeps moving, and over 4 minutes, it can go as high as 90 and as low as 50. And this is normal. In fact, this is healthy because, again, if you were tracking a car moving through a windy mountain road, you'd notice that it's constantly adjusting its speed. This is what our heart is doing in a healthy state. It's capable of adjusting its speed. This is referred to as heart rate variability, and the more variability you have, the healthier your body is. But this kind of variability here is quite chaotic. You notice that you can't tell me where is this going here. You don't know if it's going to go up or down because there is no order to this variability. Now look at this picture. This is a very different kind of variability. There still is a lot of variability. There's a lot of amplitude in the ups and down movements, up and down movements of this heart. Right? But at the same time that there's a lot of good, healthy variability, it also happens to be quite regular. Does that make sense? In fact, you know exactly now where this is going. Yes? So this is referred to as coherence in heart rate variability. And it turns out that this state is what you find when people spontaneously enter a state of happiness, of gratitude, of contentment, of joy, whereas this state is what you find in people undergoing panic attacks, anger, anxiety of all sorts, depression. And it's one of the best predictors of long-term ill health. Whereas this is one of the best predictors we have of long-term good health. So it's not just psychological aspects, but also entire sign of the health of the entire physiology. Now this is what happens to our heart rate variability over as we age. And here we have people, each dot is a person, and they go from the age of 10 to the age of 100, right? And what you see is that we lose about 3% of heart rate variability per year as we grow older. When we go under a certain level, it means the brake and the accelerator are so worn that you can't speed up and you can't slow down, like an old car. When you go under a certain level of variability, you're very close to death. And so one of the big messages of this graph is that the older you get, the closer you get to death. But you also see another very interesting bit on this graph. Look at that here. This is a 95-year-old person, most likely a woman. And you see that her heart rate variability is way above a whole bunch of people in their 30s and 40s, right? So this is not ineluctable, it's not inevitable that we lose all of the health in our physiology as we grow older. And I'm going to show you one of the key methods for building strong coherence and heart rate variability within your own bodies. And you'll notice that as you do that, you actually feel better in your mind as well. And this is entirely at your disposal. It is your birthright, which just nobody has ever taught us how to practice that. In fact, I'm really looking forward to a time which will happen soon where we teach this to children in school. So for this, I'm going to need a volunteer. But before you all jump up here, I'm going to cheat and put restrictions on the volunteer. See, I need to cheat first. So the first thing, and the reason I'm cheating is to make it easier. This is going to take a total of 7 minutes, so I have to make sure I have the right person who makes it easier. The first thing is we know that, as I showed you, the older you are, the less variability you have. So it's easier if I have somebody who's less than 40 years old. I'm sorry, this is a great act of ageism, but it makes it maybe 45. It makes it a lot easier. The second thing is we know that most medications actually interfere with heart rate variability. So, and this is a problem because in the U.S. Roughly 1 in 5 women is now taking an antidepressant. In France, it's about the same levels. 1 in 3 visits to a physician by a woman, for any reason, leads to the prescription of an antidepressant. So there's a good number of you in the room, I'm sorry to say that. The second restriction is I'd like somebody who's less than 45 and is not taking any medication. The third restriction has to do with our biological origins. When our emotional brain developed in the savanna of Africa, there was simply never any circumstance where having 100 pairs of eyes staring at you in silence was a good omen. It generally signified that you were about to be eaten for dinner or some other form of distress. So we know that, in fact, when you ask people about the most common fears, and you rate them, and fear of snakes, fear of mice, fear of heights, fear of tunnels, or whatever, fear of death is the second most common fear in the population. And the number 1 fear, which comes before fear of death, is fear of public speaking. There is something about being in front of a large number of eyes staring at you, which kicks into the emotional brain right away. So for this reason, in order to make my demonstration a little easier, I generally ask that the person who volunteers has had some experience, and not much at all, but some experience turning inside, has practiced meditation, has taken a few classes of yoga. I'm certainly not looking for a master, but someone who's had a little bit of experience doing that. So is there anybody left in this room? Okay. Good. So I'm going to need a chair right here, please. So this device will detect changes in the color of your earlobe after each heartbeat. Okay. Every time your heartbeat, Dorina, your heart beats, it brings blood to the earlobe. No, you don't worry about it. So every time your heart beats, it brings a little bit of blood to your earlobe, and this is what this is detected. And then when the blood withdraws from your ear, and then it also detects that. So if all goes well, we should be seeing, she has a heart. Yeah. Here it is, here it is. She has one, a big heart, Dorina, we're happy to see. So this is, these are the consecutive heartbeats of Dorina. And what the computer does is it looks for the distance between these two peaks. That's the interval between two consecutive beats. And for each of these, it computes how many beats per minute would that be if it stayed like that, right? And this is what it tells us here, beats per minute. You see, so she starts around, she's around right now, she's around 90, 95, okay? She's actually quite a calm person, I'm impressed. And now, Dorina, I'm just going to ask you to do a little bit of a mental task to see the link between your brain and your heart. So what the task I'd like you to do is take a number like 1,365, subtract 7 from that, and keep subtracting 7 and do it aloud and as fast as you can. 1,365 minus 7. Alright, so what you see, she doesn't even have to do it. Just thinking about doing it immediately has an impact. Well, she's off the scale now. Okay. So this is how powerful that link is between whatever goes on in our emotional brain and the connection with our heart. Okay, so I can keep going on and torture her like this for a while, but this is not the purpose of the exercise. Now, from this point on, we're only going to do pleasant things. And what I will suggest is, you also notice that, in fact, if we compute the percentage of chaos, you see how there's good variability, which is good, but it varies in a very unpredictable way. And the computer here tells us that there's 91% chaos in this spectrum of variability, which is quite normal, plus she's about to be eaten for dinner. And now what we're going to do is an exercise which I invite you to join us in doing. I'm going to focus on Dorina, but you can do it with us. Follow the same instructions, and the same things will happen within your physiology, although we'll only be witnessing hers. Does that make sense? So I would encourage you to lean back in your chair, put both feet on the ground, keep your back straight. And we're going to start the exercise by taking 2 slow, deep breaths. And another one as we begin to turn our attention inward. Very good. And as you continue, breathe slowly and deeply. I'd like you to focus your attention on the area of your heart, in your chest. If you don't feel your heart, you can focus on the center of your chest. And with each in-breath, I'd like you to imagine that you can feel the flow coming through your heart of air, purity, oxygen, then diffusing throughout your body. And with each out-breath, imagine that you can feel the flow through your heart of carbon dioxide, impurities, and all the tension in your body. Exhale. And just continue to breathe slowly and deeply when focusing on this sensation through your heart. And also let yourself sink. And just continue to breathe slowly until the next in-breath flows in by itself. Just notice what you feel during that little pause. Perhaps a tingling or a sensation of warmth, or perhaps simply a sense of expansion within your chest. And that is typically the first sign of coherence setting in. Some people find it helpful during that little pause to imagine that it's a bit as if they're coming to put a kiss on the forehead of a child, which is inside of them. And just continue, breathe slowly. Very good. Good. Now when you're ready, and when you want, open your eyes at your own rate and come back to this room. And what you see here on the screen is this pattern of coherence that Dorina is starting to build. You see that she's reduced the chaos to 58%. She's built up medium coherence to 36%, and even started to build high coherence here. You see how this is setting in. That is quite a feat to do this in front of 100 people when you've never practiced before. You see the whole experience here. Starting, thinking about doing calculations, even though you're not doing them, and then building coherence over time. And you see the difference in this spectrum and this one. Right? Thank you very much. This is a study that was published in the British Medical Journal just a few years ago, showing what happens when Buddhist monks, no, actually, not even, when regular people, like you and me, start to recite the Ave Maria. Well, this happens to be in Latin because it was done in Italy, and everybody here in Lombardy, is that how you say it in English? Lombardy knows the Ave Maria in Latin. So the experimenters had them recite the Ave Maria in Latin. And what you see is that very quickly, this is the heart rate here, and it enters this pattern of coherence. But not only that, but it does it throughout the systems in the body. This is the same thing happens in the blood pressure variation, and even in the blood pressure going to the brain, which starts varying with that same pattern. Now, they also took these regular people and had them use the Om Mani Padme Hum mantra that is used in yoga and in the Buddhist tradition, and they found exactly the same kind of results. It's quite impressive. In fact, they concluded, they did some historical research after that, quite puzzled by this finding, and they realized that the Ave Maria had come to the Crusaders from the Chinese and the Tibetans through the Indians. Who had been practicing this method, and then the Arabs who were trading with the Tibetans and the Indians transmitted this method to the Crusaders, who brought it back and applied it to their own cultural tradition and made it into the Ave Maria, the way of reciting the Ave Maria. Now, let's move on to something else, which is nutrition. Now, I can tell you what I learned in medical school about nutrition. It's somewhat less than what anyone who reads Cosmopolitan on a regular basis would. I learned that if you're overweight, you should eat fewer calories. I learned that if you have heart disease, you should eat less fat and cholesterol. I heard that if you have high blood pressure, you should eat less salt, and that if you have diabetes, you should eat less sugar. That was the end of my nutrition course in medical school. Now, needless to say, in psychiatry, we learn even less about nutrition. And what is the link between nutrition and mental health? You know, how could there be any link in the first place? Well, it turns out that the brain is 60% fat. one of you, I mean, Americans don't have this experience. As a French child, I did eat sheep brains. On a few occasions, we didn't have a great liking for them, but it was almost a mandatory thing for children to eat on a regular basis. And you know, when you do eat it, that the brain is 60% fat, just why it's disgusting. Now, the brain is also made for 20% of a form of fat that is referred to as essential fatty acids, meaning that the body cannot manufacture them. That is a very important point. 20% of your brain. Now, if you can't make the link with 20%, imagine 20% of your income. You get it right away. If you were to take away 20% of your income, you realize it wouldn't quite work. So 20% of your brain is made of a kind of fat that it needs to function, but that it cannot build. Where does it come from? The only place it comes from is from what you eat. And if it is not in your plate, it is not in your brain. It is as simple as that. Now, there are two kinds of these essential fatty acids, and this is how differently they behave once they're incorporated in the brain. These are the omega-6 fatty acid family, very rigid and stiff. And these are the omega-3 fatty acids, which, as you can see, once they're inside the membrane of neurons, have a very different kind of behavior. They have different structural properties. They provide neuronal membranes with very powerful flexibility, which allows them to communicate with each other in a much more efficient way. Some people have faces of disgust. I actually think this one is cute. You want to pet it, right? Don't you want to pet it? So this is how different these omega-3s and omega-6s are in terms of the structural properties they confer to our neural membranes. But even more powerfully than this, they get transformed in the body into very active molecules that have very different effects on physiology. So this is the omega-6 family, and if you eat a lot of these, then you'll have a lot of these molecules. And these molecules tend to trigger inflammation. Sorry, this is in French, but this trigger inflammation, inflammatory mechanisms, and coagulation, platelet aggregation. So they can clog blood vessels and they can trigger inflammation throughout the body. These omega-3s here trigger a whole different family of molecules which have the opposite effect. They fight against inflammation and they fight against overcoagulation, overclotting. Okay? Now, when you have just as many omega-6s and omega-3s in your plate, you have just as many in your body because there's no other source than your plate. And then these reactions of inflammation and anti-inflammation are in perfect balance. Is that clear? Now this is what happened over time. When our genes developed, we were in an environment where there was very little saturated fat because we were not terribly good hunters. And in addition, whatever animals we might hunt were very lean and mean, so they didn't have much fat. At the same time, there were just as many omega-6s and omega-3s in our environment. So our genes are meant to function with this mix. You know, our genes have not changed one iota in 10,000 years, probably very little in 100,000 years. So developed to function with that mix. Now, we developed farming, so we got much better at raising fat animals that we then eat. So our exposure to saturated fat has dramatically increased, particularly over the 19th and 20th century. But that's something very dramatic happened around World War II. After World War II, we stopped feeding animals with grass. And we started feeding them practically only with corn and soy. There's a wonderful book that was recently published in the US by a professor of journalism at Berkeley called The Omnivore's Dilemma, that traces the whole corn industry in the United States. So now we feed animals with corn and soy. It turns out that corn and soy have almost no omega-3 fatty acids and a lot of omega-6s. So now the meats that we eat, the milk that we drink, the cheese, butter, cream, eggs, all of them are completely imbalanced in favor of omega-6s with no omega-3s. And now if you look at what is in the diet of Westerners, this is the ratio of saturated fats, omega-6s and omega-3s. Now think of a lawnmower that is meant to function with a particular mix of gasoline and oil, right? And this is the mix we're meant to function with. And this is the mix we're putting in the engine. It's going to have problems. And we know what the problems are. This is the economist. If you put the wrong mix in the engine, physiology has a real hard time functioning. And it sputters. And this is one of the ways in which it sputters. As a psychiatrist, what I'm most interested in is not only what happens to the envelope, but what happens within the brain. I told you 20% of the brain is made of the stuff that comes in your plate. Now, there are powerful consequences on the brain. Oh, this is just a reminder. This is the soy oil production for food consumption in the US in numbers of kilograms per person per year. And you see that it starts to explode after 1940. It's an exponential rise. This has powerful consequences on the brain. This is a Lancet study that looks at the rates of depression in a variety of countries as a function of the amount of fish that people eat. Now, fish are the best source of omega-3, is the best source of omega-3 fatty acids. Now, it's not a subtle relationship, right? Countries where people eat a lot of fish have very low rates of depression. Countries where people eat very little fish have very high rates of depression. Yeah, New Zealand is an island, but they have practically zero tradition of eating fish. They eat lamb and cows. Now, at Harvard, somebody had the brilliant idea of saying, well, if that is true, and if this affects depression, if we take people who have a lot of episodes of depression and we give them omega-3 fatty acids, we should see a difference. So this is the first study that was done on this issue at Harvard. And they took people who had 4 episodes of depression per year or more. Now, on average, an episode lasts 2 months. So 4 episodes a year is 8 months spent being depressed. But some people had more than that. Okay? They took these people and they gave them either omega-3 fatty acids or olive oil. Now, olive oil is wonderful, has all kinds of beneficial aspects, but it has low omega-3 fatty acids in it. So it's a very good placebo, because you're not hurting these people, but you're not giving them the omega-3, extra omega-3 fatty acids. Now, this is what happened. Here you see the number of people on olive oil who remain undepressed. So at the beginning of the study, none of them are. You give it to them when they're not depressed, right? And then you just follow them over time and see if they get depressed. And these are the people who remain undepressed, and you see that they fall like flies. So they're not protected whatsoever. And these are the folks on omega-3s. And only one relapsed within 3 months. So much so that at this point, the ethics committee of Harvard stopped the study and said, folks, you can't keep doing this to people. Obviously, these are protected, these aren't. It would be unethical to not give omega-3 fatty acids to all of these people. Now, since then, there have been 7 more studies. And under a variety of forms, this is what they found, that omega-3 fatty acids help protect against a relapse of depression or help potentiate the effect of an antidepressant even when it hasn't worked before. This is a study looking at aggression. These are women with a particularly aggressive personality, and these receive a placebo and these receive omega-3s. And there's another Harvard study, and it found a very dramatic reduction in their tendency to be hostile and aggressive when they take omega-3 fatty acids. This is a study of children, and this is information that very few of you who are mothers in this room have received, yet it is painful that it's not being spread more. This was an Oxford study of 116 children between 8 and 12 who received for 3 months either placebo or omega-3 fatty acids. All of these children had some problems with attention. And this is what they found. That those on the omega-3s, the yellow bars, improved on problems of attention, on impulsivity and agitation, on cognitive functions, on hyperactivity, on shyness and timidity, on opposition, and on emotional stability. They improved on every single measure that is related to the ADHD complex that is now so familiar. Roughly 5% of US children are now getting Ritalin for ADHD. The effect size, the clinical benefit of omega-3s in this study was roughly the same as that of Ritalin. They even found something else. And I was interviewed by Le Monde about 2 years ago when this study came out, and I told them about the study, and they said it could not be true I was actually attacked personally for spreading false information. Because they said this just cannot be true. In that study, done again by Oxford, what they found is that the children who were taking placebo, after 3 months of being in school, had improved by 3 months on their reading skill. It's not terribly surprising. On the writing skill, they'd only improved by 1.5 months, which isn't that great. Those who were getting omega-3s had improved by 9.5 months on reading and by 6.5 on writing. So therefore, they were learning how to read about 3 times faster. Where the only difference in this double-blind study was that their brain was getting the fuel that it needs to function, which is no longer part of our diet. I'm going to skip that and probably finish on this slide. This is the last slide. It's a whole other topic that we, in fact, could spend a whole evening on, and particularly in a church context. But I don't want to leave you tonight with the impression that the key to mental health is only eating fish. There's a lot more to mental health than that. And we now have very good science to confirm the fact that what our emotional brain is most sensitive to is the nature of our relationships to each other. In fact, this is a study from the 50s, which is very dramatic, where this little monkey displays all of the physiological and behavioral aspects of depression. It's not missing one. And the only thing that happened to it is not like we withdrew Prozac from him or that we didn't give him omega-3 fatty acid. He was separated from his mother. That's the only thing. Separation from relationships that nurture us can lead to all of the symptoms of depression in our behavior and in our physiology. Our brain is extraordinarily sensitive to the nature of a relationship, and particularly our emotional brain. This is a fascinating study. It was published in Science that looked at students who were placed in a scanner and asked to participate in the really silly sort of beach game where on the computer screen they had to pass a frisbee to another student who was presumably in another room. And then this other student would pass the frisbee to another one, and all of that was just on the screen. Okay? And then so he met those other students beforehand, then was placed in the scanner. But while in the scanner, the game is rigged so that the computer actually controls it and plays in such a way that nobody passes the frisbee back to him. So it's sort of a minor insult, quite minor. What is interesting, though, is that what you see in his brain is that the area that lights up is the same area that lights up when we experience physical pain. So something as minor as being excluded from a group of strangers passing around the frisbee lights up the area of the brain that is specialized for the experience of physical pain. It tells you how sensitive we are to our social interactions. And this is also a beautiful study where they looked at women placed in a scanner who received mild electric shocks. And in one case, nobody was sitting with them. And you see areas of their brain, such as the hypothalamus, sort of the core area of the emotional brain that releases all the hormones in the body, really lights up when they're in the scanner, even before they get the electric shock. And they've experienced it, and you put them in the scanner, and then you tell them they're going to get it again. And this part of the brain lights up because they're afraid. Okay? Then you also ask them to, you have a stranger hold their hand. When a stranger holds their hand, somebody they never met and they don't even see, they just feel their hand, then that actually reduces the intensity of that reaction in their brain. And then you have their husband hold their hand. And then it gets even more interesting, because not only that generally reduces even more the response of their brain, it really modulates the response of the brain to the anticipation or the experience of physical pain. But then what they were able to find is that it does it even more so as a function of the quality of the relationship with the husband. So that if the relationship doesn't work so well, then it doesn't modulate it so much. But if the relationship really does work, then it really tempers the effect of electric shock on the brain. So whatever happens at every moment in our emotional brain is very much related to our interactions and our places in the world and our relationships with other people that provide us with meaning and direction and purpose in our life. So I will stop at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did you remember fearful things from the past, or was it just a vague sense of fear, not connected to?
When the amygdala is stimulated, as did the experiment with my brother, did it bring up fears from the past, or is it a different experience of fear? Is that? I did it before him, but just did it in the scanner, so I can tell you what my experience was, and maybe he can tell you his. But my experience was of raw fear that is not attached to anything. It was a very strange sensation. I see him shaking his hand. It's a very strange sensation. It's just raw terror, and you don't know where it's coming from. Fortunately, in my case, it did last only a minute. That's why I felt comfortable. But yes.
Can you tell us how much omega-3 is useful?
Okay. How much omega-3s are to get benefits? It's a little different if you're not yet depressed or if you already are. We know that as a preventive measure, you need roughly 2 servings of fatty fish per week. And the serving of fatty fish is 3 ounces of salmon, for example. So it's a salmon steak. Or a can of sardines. Okay. Sardines are my favorite because they're the cheapest. They're pretty good, and they're also very small. I like them. You don't like them. They're also very small, and they don't live long, so they don't accumulate the mercury, the PCBs, and dioxins that are at the bottom of the sea, which are accumulating in big predatory fish. So tuna is not a very good source because of that. I would advise not to eat tuna more than once a month, for example, because of that. Gail.fr, but it's in English as well at under instincttoheal.org or nofreudnoprozac.org. Called OM3 Junior. That was specifically designed by the woman who conducted the Oxford study. I'm not sure if it's available in the US yet. Yes. Difficult question to answer. We have good studies on eating fish in prevention. We have no studies on eating fish for treatment of depression. There are studies with supplements, and so that I can only answer that the studies have used supplements that have shown a benefit for people who already have symptoms of depression. Yes?
I don't understand clearly your position toward medicine. Do we have to elevate completely medicine or to find compromise?
No. This gentleman says he does not understand clearly what is my position toward medicine. Do we have to eliminate medicine, or do we have to keep some of it? Okay, my answer to this, I tried to address this at the beginning. I'm a conventionally trained physician. I would still use antidepressants when needed. I don't have a problem with that. I advise people who have bipolar illness, with episodes of mania and depression, to remain on their mood-stabilizing drugs. I think they can do much better if they incorporate some of these approaches of treatment that tap into the body's natural ability to maintain health. I am appalled by the fact that our medical system, as it is constructed, does not use these approaches. And I know the reasons for that. I don't want to get into this. It's not even a controversy. It's obvious. The reason for that is that all of the methods I talked about tonight are not patentable. You cannot patent breathing. You cannot patent fish. You cannot patent eye movements. You cannot, and it's true for, you cannot patent sunrise. You cannot patent acupuncture. You cannot patent any of these things. So even if they're proven to work, nobody's pushing for them to be integrated within the medical system or for them to be taught in medical school. There's no lobbying, there's no advertising in medical journals for any of these methods, and they just do not integrate the system, aside from the efforts of some leading integrative medicine centers, such as the one at Duke or at Stanford, or which are now the one in Pittsburgh that we started. which are not leading the way. But it is a difficult effort because there's no money. You know, when as a psychiatrist, it always strikes me that if I prescribe Prozac, then a whole bunch of people make money. You know, the pharmacy down the street makes money. The people who carry drugs around the country make money. The pharmaceutical company makes money. The medical journals that have ads for Prozac make money. And then the funny thing is, in the US, as you know, our pension funds are invested in pharmaceutical companies. So I make money, whether I want it or not. If I prescribe Prozac, my pension fund is invested in Eli Lilly and Pfizer. So I make money. If I tell you to eat fish, who makes money?
The fishes are. You don't know where you are, you get more far.
So your question is
it's not question. I just like to clarify it this way. You never even once mentioned about this way. How you are mentioning this way? How is this way? Because you just like to take a symptom and you
okay, I don't think people can hear you very well, so let me try to rephrase that. You're saying that you have a comment and a question in your mind that you're not formulating about how can this make sense, because all of the traditional systems of medicine, whether Western or even Tibetan, have a theory of causality, that you identify a problem with the person's physiology and you try to address that problem. Is that a fair understanding? And none of what I've presented tonight goes along those lines. And you're saying even psychoanalysis functions in that way. Well, I don't entirely agree. What I'm saying is that a lot of the people that I'm seeing have a deficit of their basic mechanisms of keeping physiology in balance. If you've been traumatized, for example, then your physiology has been thrown out of balance, like you're carrying an abscess. It happens to be a psychological abscess, but it's the same thing. And then we address that. If you have unbalanced nutrition, which is true for 99% of us, then your physiology cannot find its balance again. So there's a deficit. My analysis of illness is in terms of deficits of the basic mechanisms of health. You see a Tibetan physician, he will advise you to eat differently. He will advise you to, see a Tibetan physician, he will advise you to eat differently. He will advise you to meditate, and he will advise you to do some acupuncture. So they're reinforcing, the whole Chinese system of medicine identifies the weaknesses in your body. It doesn't identify the disease so much as what are your basic deficits in your body's ability to face illness. And then they reinforce that, which is a very different perspective than the Western perspective, which only identifies illness, symptoms. Yes?
What do you have to say about
about what? What do I have to say about? OBE. OB Ben Kenobi. Huh?
Out of body experiences.
Oh, out of body experiences. This is, do people know what this refers to, out of body experiences? Well, this is when people usually under great trauma or stress, or under physical stress, such as during medical conditions. It's very common in intensive care units or during cardiac resuscitation, for example. When people have the impression of floating outside of their body and seeing themselves from outside of their body. Is that right? Is that what you're referring to? So when you're asking me, what do I have to say about that? Okay. It's a very strange state of mind which definitely exists. It's common. It's in every culture and it's always existed. So it seems to be tied to, one of the natural functions of the mind. We know, for example, that, well, I don't want to go into near-death experiences, which is yet a whole other field. It does happen under stress, and it seems really connected to the ability of the mind to split itself off from a regular stream of consciousness. It doesn't, I don't have much more to say. The near-death experiences link it with some spiritual states. The near-death experiences link it with some spiritual states, which I don't have a problem with. To measure the frequency of these near-death experiences, Dutch cardiologist who systematically monitors when people had cardiac resuscitation, and he was able to show that roughly almost 20% of people, 1 in 5, have these experiences of seeing a bright light and feeling warm and cozy and being welcomed and so on, which are clearly they're an extreme form of out-of-body experience, and this is when they're clinically dead too, so it's very peculiar. But let's not get into this topic too much. Is there a connection between this particular spot, which is it's one of yes, it's one of the chakras, and the emotional brain. Not that I know.
So this method of the eye.
Can you find physicians or other practitioners? It's not to Paris. I still teach in Pittsburgh, but I live in Paris. Yes, when I came from Pittsburgh to Paris, I still teach in Pittsburgh, but I live in Paris. It's complicated, but I started the French EMDR Association, and I teach EMDR in France to psychiatrists and psychologists and psychotherapists. So I would encourage you to go on the website called emdr-france.org. Practitioner who've been certified by area. By area of France and by arrondissement in Paris. Yes.
Just a question about this self-eye. If one wants to do it aloud, can you do it, or is another person must serve?
Can you do it yourself? Is that your question? Yes. It's an interesting question, and the reality is that you can do it yourself. You'll see that you get some form of soothing generally from doing that, but you cannot get the same kind of treatment effects or results that we observe in therapy. And one of the difficulties is that if you push it too hard on a very painful memory, it might actually, just as it happened in the woman I showed you, it might link you up with something much more painful than what you started from, and there'll be nobody there to pick up the pieces. So this is why we teach therapists how to manage the very high level of affect that often arises with this treatment. And if you're by yourself, it's not terribly advisable. Yes?
Is it clearly treatment? Do you have to go very, very frequently? It depends on which illness you have or what memories you want to lose. Depression or memories you've got.
Do the eye movements have to be quick, and does it depend on your problem?
How many times?
How many sessions? Okay. It's not a function of the diagnosis, it's a function of the trauma. And people who've been traumatized once, like in a car accident or even a single rape, and a rape is a pretty potent trauma, but if it happened only once, it's highly responsive to treatment. But people who've been through chronic abuse over a long period of time require months, if not a year or two of treatment once a week. So it's you cannot really answer it that way. But for a single trauma, in a car accident, an abortion, sometimes it's one session. You were just curious, Harvard study.
Yeah, when those were done, the omega-3 depression studies.
The one I showed you. The more recent one I showed you from Harvard was the one I showed you. The more recent one I showed you from Harvard was 2003. There've been a number of new ones. I mean, the study I showed from Oxford with children was just replicated in Australia, just published a couple months ago. So I can give you, I know what you're after, I can give you an updated list. No, wait, journalists often ask me that. I can give you a list of all of the recent papers that have sort of supported these approaches since the publication of my book. For example, there was a Boston University study funded by the NIH that had just looked at EMDR compared to Prozac in people with very high levels of trauma. And the results were stunning. Let me see if I may have this right here. But in essence, what they did in the studies is they took people with high levels of trauma, they give them either 8 weeks of Prozac, or 8 sessions of EMDR once a week, okay? And this is what they They found Philips filter.
Sunlight.
This was just published in January 2007. This was just published in January 2007 in American Journal of Clinical Psychiatry. There have also been more studies of exercise. Here we go. Okay, this is Prozac. So after 8 weeks of treatment, 20% of people in this study no longer had symptoms. It's pretty impressive. No longer had symptoms. Then they stopped Prozac and they looked 6 months later, 0% of them are still, symptoms come back. This is EMDR. Symptoms come back. This is EMDR. After 8 weeks of treatment, about 47, about 50% of them no longer have symptoms. Then you stop treatment and you look 6 months later and it's now 75. So it's really triggered a mechanism of...
Antidepressant?
No, this one there was just with Prozac.
Yes, you are taking only the Prozac. Are you taking also other antidepressants?
No, this one there was just with Prozac.